The first two actual videos on this channel were cases about absurdly weird treatment of animals. And after doing those two, I promised for that the next video I wouldn't talk about animals at all. Now that promise is fulfilled, we are back to our regularly scheduled segment about the probably hypothetical but really weird treatment of animals. And no, I did not intend this to become a habit or like a theme for this channel. It's just the stories I keep running into, man. Anyway, I'll begin this at the chronological endpoint of this story, which are just some articles and media around the story in the last decade. I kinda had to start with these because I don't remember how I first heard about this case. I just found a note on my phone from over a year ago saying, "Video on Salt Lake whale experiment," and I saw that and I was like, oh, well, I know what I must do next. There isn't much coverage on the case. This is a really small story if you've looked into it, but I suppose some notable mentions are a photo hoax from 2018 by the studio Luminaria, who I might use some photos from while editing this video, and there was also a short film about a year ago called Whales in the High Desert. My point in saying all of this, aside from just citing a few things, is to segue to a source that most of these websites, not all, most of them, point to, which I will now read out to you. From the Utah Enquirer, June 24th, 1890, Whales in the Salt Lake. 2 young whales placed in the lake have raised a large family. Intelligent newspaper readers have not forgotten the inauguration 15 years ago by Mr. James Wickham, a scientific English gentleman of the whale industry in the Great Salt Lake. As considerable time was required for the development of the experiment, the subject has passed out of the public mind, but has by no means been forgotten by naturalists and capitalists interested in the whale fishery. The whale is the largest and probably the longest-lived animal. They have been known to grow to 100 feet in length and have the age of 400 years. It is a mammal, or in other words, suckles its young. The project of Mr. Wickham was greatly assisted by this fact, for the difficulty that would attend the obtaining of whale eggs in the deep seas is at once apparent. It was only necessary to obtain a pair of the whales in order to begin the propagation of animals under domestication. The southern or Australian whale was selected as the best suited to the Great Salt Lake. The greater part of 2 years was occupied off the coast of Australia by a vessel sent especially for the purpose and continued efforts to capture the young whales without injury. The feat, however, was at least accomplished, and the beasts, each about 35 feet long, were shipped to San Francisco in 1873 in tanks built expressly for them. 50 tanks of seawater accomplished their overlanded shipment to ensure plentiful supplies of the natural element. Mr. Wickham came from London in person to superintend the planting of his Leviathan pets. He selected a small bay near the mouth of the Bear River, connected with the main water by a shallow strait half a mile wide. Across the strait he built a wire fence, and inside the pen so formed he turned the whales loose. After a few minutes' inactivity, they disported themselves in a lively manner, spouting water as in the mid-ocean, but as if taking in by instinct or intention the cramped character of their new home, they suddenly made a beeline for deep water, and shot through the wire fence as if it had been made of threads. In 20 minutes they were out of sight, and the chagrined Mr. Wickham stood gazing helplessly at the big salt water. If the Great Salt Lake were in Asia, it would be called a sea. It is 75 miles long and from 30 to 40 wide, so it is easy to perceive how readily the whales could vanish from sight. Though the enterprising owner was, of course, disappointed and doubtful of results, he left an agent behind him to look after his floating property. 6 months later, Mr. Wickham's representative came upon the whales 50 miles from the bay where they had broken away, and from that time to the present they have been observed at intervals by him and the watermen who ply the lake, spouting and playing. Within the last few days, however, Mr. Wickham cabled directions to make careful inspection and report the developments, and the agent followed the whales for 5 successive days and nights, discovering that the original pair are now 60 feet in length, and followed by a school of several hundred young varying in length from 3 to 15 feet, The scheme is a surprising and complete success, and Mr. Wickham has earned the thanks of mankind. Catching whales in the Great Salt Lake and following that business on the dangerous Greenland coast are two quite different things. The enormous value of the new industry can be better appreciated by remembering that a single whale produces 20 tons of pure oil. I'll break down that article here in a moment, but before that I want to acknowledge some slightly better reporting that pointed to a few other sources. One being an update article by the Utah Enquirer about a month later saying this: "The whale story. We have received a communication from Mr. Moses Claff of Pima, Arizona, in relation to the account recently published in the Enquirer concerning 2 whales that had been captured on the shores of Australia and transported to the Great Salt Lake. We will state for the benefit of distant readers of the Enquirer that the piece was clipped from an Eastern exchange and published by the Enquirer and other Utah papers to show the ridiculousness with which some of the Eastern papers refer to Utah matters. It would be impossible for any whale to exist in the waters of the Great Salt Lake." There's also this article by the Salt Lake Herald-Republican 3 days later, which reprints the first article I showed you with a prefixing message that 1. Hypes up Utah way more than it needs to, and 2. Makes the same point as the update article that this is just outsiders making up stories about Utah. The most important other source, though, is this previous article from the Salt Lake Herald-Republican on June 8th, 1888, which is 2 years earlier than the 1890 article, which in my experience is the one people shared around the most. It's the same script that I said earlier: intelligent newspaper readers have not forgotten, blah blah blah, but with its own very important prefixing message. The following from the Montreal Family Herald and Weekly Star comes within the range of the Munchausen articles which sensational scribblers and penny-liners hatch for the delectation of their unsuspecting readers and palm off as verities. The story will be read by the people of the West with much the same interest as a chapter from the Arabian Nights. Mr. Wickham, whoever he is, deserves the gun for the perpetration of the annexed." And then it's the same article. And whoever wrote this, I wish I had this person's vocabulary, because he said a lot of random things there. And with that said, I will give you 2 paths to diverge on from here. One, if you want to stick around and see me kind of tear into that article I showed you a bit earlier. I feel like everyone can read that and intuitively know, oh, okay, this is fake, whatever. But I personally found it kind of fun to really test the limits of something like that could hypothetically be possible, which it's not. But if you're just curious to see where the paper trail leads and how did this rumor start in the first place, whatever timestamp I put up on screen, just skip to there. To you who chose to stay, let's dig into this. I've distinguished all of the ways this newspaper account is impossible into 2 categories. On one hand is an accruement of detail errors, and on the other is just a bunch of logistical impossibilities. Starting with the former, I'm just going to kind of go through them as the article itself reads. And the first question you can raise about this article when you see it is, who is this Mr. James Wickham? To which I found literally nothing. There are no leads anywhere referencing a James Wickham that could have reasonably pulled something like this off. You would have to be incredibly wealthy to even entertain the idea of this enterprise, and I think the most influential Wickham I found that dates to the time period is like an author, I think, if I remember correctly. So basically there's nothing there. A lot of these next points are a little nitpicky, but I want to get to them anyway. A lot of them could just be dismissed as journalist commentary to an external event, which in my opinion is how the story reads, so I'll go through them pretty quick. The first dubious claim, aside from just the whole whales in the lake thing, is the claim that, in reference to whales, they have been known to grow to 100 feet in length and live to the age of 400 years. 100 feet? True for one whale, the blue whale, of course. But as for the, quote, southern or Australian whale referred to later on in the article, which I'm almost certain is referring to the southern right whale, which lives in, well, the Southern Ocean. I'll be referring to that species many times during this video, so get used to it. Anyway, the right whale grows to about a max of 45 to 60 feet, but like I said, this probably doesn't matter. I'm pretty sure this is referring to whales in general, not the specific whales of this story. What that excuse doesn't cover, however, is the immediate claim afterwards that they live up to 400 years, which no whale, not any species of whale, does. I think the closest to hit that target is the bowhead whale, which is a relative of the southern right whale. Even the most tenured specimens are hypothesized to live to around maybe just a bit over 200 years. Something I really want to rant about, and I'll try and keep it brief, is this little mention here of, quote, whale eggs. Now, if you read a lot of the articles surrounding this story, a lot of them go, ha ha, this author's so stupid, they think whales lay eggs. That's not what it says if you read the article. Quote, it is a mammal, or, in other words, suckles its young. The project of Mr. Wickham was greatly assisted by this fact, for the difficulty that would attend the obtaining of whale eggs in the deep seas is at once apparent. It was only necessary to obtain a pair of whales, and then it reads on, as I said earlier. But the point of this excerpt is that whales don't lay eggs, and that's a good thing, because it would be really hard to obtain whale eggs. Still questioning this out loud as I'm saying it to you right now, just because I saw that regurgitated so many times over and over and over again. The article is correct on this. Whales do not lay eggs, and that would be awfully convenient for an endeavor like this. Anyway, the next segment of the article kind of details how the whales were transported to the Great Salt Lake, which I'm going to skip over for a moment. And towards this part at the end where it says, within the last few days, however, which I'm pretty sure the author is implying that these are what happened in the previous days right before the original article was written. The first real claim there is that the original pair have now grown to about 60 feet in length, which, if this was the open ocean, a 35-foot right whale, which is the length specified earlier, it could probably grow that in about 15 years, so I guess that's reasonable. The claim immediately following that is definitely the most unreasonable one this article makes, which is that the whales are, quote, followed about by a school of several hundred young, varying in length from 3 to 15 feet. To be so very unnecessarily thorough, baby right whale calves exit the womb at like 16 to 20 feet, and cetaceans in general are almost exclusively uniparous, meaning they only birth one baby at a time. So that point is just literally impossible. There's also this part at the end saying a single whale produces 20 tons of pure oil, which just isn't true. They don't produce anything near that much. I thought they might have meant to say barrels of oil, but then that'd be a really big lowball. Either way, they're quite off. Moving on from what I consider to be the more nitpicky things, I want to talk about a bigger issue, which are the logistics of even transporting a whale all the way out to Utah. There are a number of ways to prove why, at the time at least, this would be impossible. The easiest way, I think, is to simply show the limitations of railroad capacity. Recalling back to the middle of the article, it says, quote, 50 tanks of seawater accomplished their overland shipment to ensure plentiful supplies of the natural element. The original author kind of glosses over the transportation aspect, probably for good reason, but I want to poke some holes in it. I wasn't able to get exact figures from the time period, but I have 2 data points from AmericanRails.com that help me get a good estimate. These numbers come from livestock cars, which themselves are already specialized railroad cars, designed to be higher in weight capacity and length. During the 1860s, you could expect one of these to be about 28 feet in length and haul about 10 tons. In the 1880s, you could expect them to be around 34 feet and 20 tons of haul. So for the 1870s, when this story takes place, you can reasonably assume it to be somewhere in between there. So, how does a whale fit into this? And I guess I mean that literally. And the troublesome part for this newspaper article is that they kinda don't. Very much don't, to be more accurate. The article itself refers to both of the whales being around 35 feet in length, which already is kinda pushing the boundaries of those 1880 cars. Especially because in this hypothetical, you'd want to give the whales like a little bit of room at least, right? But it gets worse. Using this data collected from ukwhales.org, If a roughly 56-foot right whale weighs about 176,000 pounds, and yes, I know square cube law probably messes with a lot of this, but going off of that, I feel like I could comfortably estimate like a 35-foot right whale to weigh about 113,000 pounds, or 56 tons. Combining that with the particularly imprecise measurement of 50 tanks of seawater, this experiment probably breaks the weight capacity of the time by like a multiple of 3. Railroad cars from the time just simply wouldn't be able to take on the weight burden. And this entire hypothetical itself is assuming you can actually find a way to bring a whale from Australia to San Francisco, and excluding the concern that the whale just doesn't decide to like bust a move while it's in the railroad car and then end up knocking over the whole train or something like that. But like I said, you really only needed to be able to poke a hole into one of those things, and this seemed the easiest. Which, that itself is a little hypocritical of me, because all I ever really needed to talk about this whole time is the next thing I'm going to talk about, which are the biological impossibilities of a whale surviving in the Great Salt Lake. When I first decided to seriously ponder the logistics of a whale existing within the lake, there were 3 issues that kind of immediately stood out to me: salinity, size, and feeding. I suppose you would only really need to cast doubt on one of these issues, but for whatever reason I did all 3 of them, so I guess you're gonna have to listen to me talk about it. I'll start with salinity. The ideal environment for a whale would have the conditions of about 35 grams of salt per liter of water, so 3.5%. Standard sea conditions. They can go into freshwater and brackwater conditions fine for the most part, aside from the one downside that they're a little bit more prone to infections. The thing they can't do is go into considerably more salty conditions, and the Great Salt Lake, to put it a little lightly, is considerably more salty, in some years reaching a salinity of 30%. It's easy to see that figure and just want to move on from the whole issue and be done with it. But I did have a little hunch about something, and I wanted to test the limits of this story. And my little joke theory starts with this data point, and it's that in 1873, when the hypothesized whales were supposedly planted, the lake had a record low salinity of around 13 to 14%. Now, admittedly, that figure is a little dubious. I think it came from a one-time measurement, but I think it is actually reasonable to take it seriously when you put it in conjunction with the estimated water levels of the time. The water levels around this time were experiencing a record high, which means that there is more water to dilute the salt, but still, 13 to 14%, that is still extremely, extremely unlivable for a whale. And thus I ask you to recall the mention that the whales were planted at the mouth of the Bear River, which, fortunately for me in this hypothetical, is responsible for most of the fresh water that comes into the Great Salt Lake. And this gave me a little bit of a theory, and I'll start by explaining this. Normally, when a river meets an ocean, that creates brackwater conditions, which can be classified as anywhere between 0.1% salinity and anything that isn't really the open ocean, so anything really under like 3%. That's quite a big range, so I had to narrow it down a little bit. So I decided to look at the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. Not through any particularly scientific means, I saw them on a graph and that explained all this, so I just decided to use that. But I don't think it's particularly unreasonable either. They're both still connected to the open ocean, but they also have a lot of water intake from rivers. But similar to the Bear River Bay, they're also sort of enclosed, maybe just enough to keep some of the fresh water in. The Black Sea has a salinity of about 1.75%, which means that its inflow rate and geography are enough to cut down what would be the presumed 3.5% salinity of ocean water into half. The Baltic Sea, depending on where in it you look, has a salinity of about 0.7%, which means that its inflow rate and geography are enough to cut down what would be the presumed 3.5% ocean water salinity into 1/5 of that. I use these 2 figures to make what I guess I would call a pessimistic and optimistic guess on perhaps what the conditions in the Bear River Bay might look like. I don't even know what you would need to know in order to know if these are reasonable comparisons to make, so admittedly this is a big shot in the dark. But I'm a random guy making this as a fun thought experiment, so that's the best you're getting. But as I was saying, if inflow conditions and coastal geography are enough to make salinity levels be cut in half, for specifically the Bear River Bay and the Great Salt Lake, the salinity levels there could perhaps go down from 14% to maybe 7%. So for the pessimistic estimate, the hypothetical whale's kidneys would still be quite destroyed. However, in the 1/5 estimate from the Baltic Sea, that can bring that 14% all the way down to 2.8, which is quite livable. Again, this story is obviously quite fake, but I find it really, really interesting how for some reason the author chose for this story to happen in what would technically be the most livable year in the lake, and coincidentally at the most livable part of the lake, if you know what I'm saying. Again, I could be very wrong. For all I know, the inflow rates don't actually matter as much as I think they do, and the salinity rate went down from 14% to 12%, and it doesn't affect anything. Moving on from that a little bit, I did have a further idea that could potentially lower the salinity of my calculations even more. My hunch turned out to not have anything to it, so I'm not going to explain it all to you, but I will put a little explanation on screen if you're curious. And the reason I say that is because it segues into another thing I wanted to talk about, which is the depth of the lake, which will really just emphasize how comedically unlivable this lake is for a whale, and it also completely destroys my little hypothesis about how the Bear River Bay might be just a little livable. Completely destroys that. In 1873, when the tale supposedly happened, and when there were record-high water levels, the lake had a maximum depth of 45 feet. However, in the one place I thought they might have been able to live, it had a depth of 12 feet. And the maximum depth within that entire bay is 21 feet. This is so sad. And the food thing I mentioned earlier, it actually turned out to be sort of reasonable, but I don't really care now. I put some math on screen. Read it if you want. I'm pretty sure there's also like a bunch of arsenic in the lake. That's enough for this dumb thought experiment. I'll move it on. So despite all of this overwhelming skepticism against the original article, I still wanted to go and see if there was at least some shred of truth or inspiration that led to the story, independent of the author's quite active imagination. This whole video has been me taking the story perhaps, or most definitely, more seriously than it deserves, but hey, that's how I like to do my research. So, whether it actually involved a whale somehow being brought to the lake, which would involve a truly mind-boggling amount of logistical anomalies in order to happen. Or maybe the nugget of truth just happened to be that some guy back then proposed the idea and some newspaper a decade later decided to write a fanfic about it or something. If I found anything on the spectrum between those two things, I would have considered it a win. So I searched the records. I put in my search terms, I looked through everything. Took a few hours, but unfortunately I found nothing. I found a few things that are like, maybe this is interesting, but I don't think any of them are really worth your time. I did get a few, perhaps, interesting video ideas, so not a complete waste for me, I guess. So having done all of this, I think we can all agree that it's pretty overdue to move on from this. Any imaginations or what-ifs can be put to rest, and we can move on and find the source of how all of this started. We are now at the point where I told people to skip ahead to, but do you who stayed with me recall back to the prefixing statement in the 1888 article that mentions the Montreal Family Herald and Weekly Star? I looked through any records I could find pretty thoroughly, but found nothing. It was a small-ish joint newspaper that ran from 1869 to 1968. That was really about it, but I did find something else out though, and I consider it to be much, much more interesting. When I first began researching this case, the assumption I had, which was admittedly wrong, was that this was just some goofy story that got shared around Utah for a bit. It was probably made up by some guy out east, but other than that it stayed pretty localized. Turns out, it was a little bit bigger than that. This story, by around the early middle part of 1888, went far beyond Salt Lake City and was being shared by various newspapers throughout the country. Using data from these websites, I tracked down every mention of the story I could in order to create a timeline to see just how this story spread, which admittedly was a bit for my own curiosity, But of course for this video, the goal is to determine what is the most likely original source. To keep things manageable, I only included articles between April of 1888, which is when the first reference of the story dates to, and August of 1888, which admittedly is probably further back than I needed to go. Now, as a bit of a disclaimer, which isn't really that relevant, so skip ahead if you'd like, I was a little handicapped because some of those websites I mentioned earlier require a subscription, which I can't really pay for right now, so me being a little bit clever was able to take advantage of the fact that for those paywalled websites, they do sometimes display a header image before you actually click on the article, and because of that, I was sort of able to manipulate the keywords I put into the website in order to read different parts of the article through the header image, and I think I was pretty much always able to do this just enough to see if the article referenced another article or used the same language as another article. It didn't really matter for me too much to be able to read the whole article because it was just the same copy and paste of intelligent newspaper readers have not forgotten, or it was just a summary of it. So it's not like I was getting any new information or anything. Surprisingly enough, this actually worked very well, although a little bit later on it didn't end up biting me in the butt. You'll know what I'm referring to in a bit. With that out of the way, let's go to the sources. In August, I only ever really found a few, mostly just articles referencing other articles. July, more the same, not too interesting. Like I said, I probably didn't need to include these 2 months, but I am for the sake of being thorough and to explain a few things. Like, these black markers here just mean that I don't have an actual receipt for the article, but another paper mentions it. In the case of this Montana paper, the source that points to it is actually from the UK, so there's probably some kid who read it that year who lived and died the whole time thinking whales existed out in Utah. This whole story is worth it, in my opinion, just for the knowledge of that. Throughout June, there wasn't really too much. Of course, there is the already mentioned 1888 article that led to all of this whole exploration, and of course the Montreal article that I was never able to find. Other than that, there is this one appearance of the story in Pennsylvania and one in Maine, and they have a lot of the prior ones in August and July pointing to those. The color of the lines on this map reflect which of the articles came earlier, just in case you're having trouble reading it. The bulk of the articles written within the time frame I selected appeared in May, and while most of the articles by this point don't bring much clarity to what might be the original source, 2 of them, which were printed early in the month, are the first ones to point to what I believe is the source of this whole story. It becomes a lot clearer as we move into April, because those 2, along with everything else within this month aside from this one Philadelphia paper, all direct their credit towards this one northern Alabamian newspaper, the Sheffield Enterprise, located in, well, Sheffield, Alabama. It's a small town, so I don't really expect you to have heard of it. The sad thing I have to report is that there are no online newspaper collections that date to the town before 1890. There are offline records dating back to 1888 in 2 different installments of the Enterprise, so I am actually quite confident that the article probably exists somewhere in the local libraries, but sadly I do not have the means to go there right now. And at this point in my research, it was really easy to just call it a day and be done with it. All of the earliest articles point to this one place, and that's it. Which kind of bugged me, because yeah, everything seems to originate from Sheffield in some way, but how do I know the Sheffield Enterprise isn't just taking an article from another small town, and that article is lost now? And while those concerns do still exist in some way, I did find something that helped alleviate those concerns a little bit, and it makes me feel more confident in Sheffield. And it was right under my nose in multiple ways. In the late stages of my research, I found this article, which references a Cleveland newspaper that goes on to reference the Sheffield paper, by the Salt Lake Tribune, April 22nd, 1888. Very like a whale. It's the same old article intelligent newspaper readers have not forgotten, but with some prefixing and suffixing statements from a pretty ambiguous source. I will read them out to you now. Editor Tribune, I enclose a copy of the Sheffield, Alabama, Enterprise, which contains an article on a new industry. I hadn't thought of it before, but it is nearly time the lake was full of whales, isn't it? I would like to know if you think they are ripe. If so, I shall spend next winter whaling Sheol out of the old Salt Lake. Will it be necessary to get a permit from the church to conduct the whaling business? There are thousands of us here in the East who will engage in the business if we can make it profitable. There's millions in it if there's no drawbacks. Let's know all the particulars. With kind regards, yours, Prescott. Cleveland, Ohio, April 5th, 1888. The Whale Story. The communication referred to above purports to date from this city March 31st and is as follows. Later on in the article, remarks by the Tribune. The young whales are too small as yet for hunting, and we understand the old pair are to be utilized. The Central Pacific Railroad Company proposed to run a switch down to the lake shore from Kelton, and Tarpey has now 2 vaqueros breaking the old pair. The proposition is to build an immense ferry boat like that at Benica, run the trains onto the boats and tow them down by whale power. Tarpey thinks he will have them thoroughly broken by the time the boat is ready. Everybody knows that the railroad grade is very heavy around the head of the lake. It is expected that the whales can tow the boat down from Kelton 90 miles in an hour and a half, thus saving 3.5 hours coming from and going west. The younger whales will not be ready for harpooning before a year after the next, but the liar who first started the canard ought to be harpooned at once. Now, I have to come clean here a little bit and admit that the article I put on screen while I was reading all that out to you wasn't actually from the Salt Lake Tribune. The article I did put on screen is from the Jefferson County Sentinel, or Age Sentinel, it's also called, a newspaper from Boulder, Montana. The reason I'm showing you this one is, one, because the Salt Lake Tribune one is incredibly grainy. It took me like a whole hour to decipher everything in it. But also because this is that little blunder I was talking about earlier. I had skipped over all of this useful information because of my little preview manipulation trick I mentioned earlier, which could have been excusable because I don't have access to the article by normal means, except for the fact that a clipping of it was inside the Wikipedia article for the story. Always reread things, people. You might have skipped over things you didn't realize were important when you first read it. But back to the contents of the article, they're pretty much the same in both the variations, except for this little header that says Salt Lake Tribune up here. I found it a little difficult to interpret everything in it, even now I'm a little unsure on some stuff, but here are what I think are the conclusions you can draw from it. I still have the Jefferson County Sentinel article on screen, but pretend I'm referring to the Salt Lake Tribune article. This article refers to another newspaper, the Tribune, in quotation marks, which is why I don't think the Tribune refers to the Salt Lake Tribune. You wouldn't refer to yourself as the Tribune in quotation marks. The letter at the beginning of the article seems to be sent to that Tribune, and I believe the little insert right under that note, when they say, the communication referred to above, I read it as them talking about whatever was in that original Sheffield article, which they date to March 31st. The letter itself, however, dates to April 5th. And I think I actually kind of forgot to mention this, but the first actual document of this story is on April 6th from a Cincinnati Enquirer. It of course references Sheffield, but doesn't really give much other info. My best guess at who is this mysterious The Tribune is, believe it or not, a newspaper that ran at the time called The Tribune, from Cleveland, of course. There are no online records dating to the time from this newspaper, of course, but the reason I believe it's them is its proximity to the Cincinnati Enquirer. They're both in Ohio. So my real theory on how this spread is it starts in Sheffield, something happens there, this Mr. Prescott picks it up, sends it to The Tribune. Cincinnati, being so close, picks it up pretty quickly, and those two cities, being much, much bigger than Sheffield, become the bottleneck for how this story spreads. But the real reason I find this so important is that it gives a concrete date on what happened in Sheffield, and those close proximity between the dates makes me feel a lot more confident that they just didn't take the article from another town and reprint it as their story. One last thing I'd like to do before I end this video is theorize for a bit on what might be the contents of that Sheffield article, and I think it lies on a spectrum between either an intentional hoax or a sci-fi fanfic that a bunch of people saw and took way too seriously. And within that, I think I lean much more towards the hoax aspect of the story. And my reasoning behind that lies with the two Ohio articles. First, the Cincinnati Enquirer, which was actually 2 days later, not 1 day later than the letter. But anyway, it's just the same old letter, but with this message heading on top: Salt Lake City Special, Sheffield, Alabama Enterprise. That message makes it seem like the Sheffield Enquirer received a letter from Salt Lake City, which would really only be the case if you were making a hoax and wanted to make it look real like that, or if you were being fooled by somebody else, which they may have been, which really just means the hoaxer would be someone else, so still a hoax. And going back to the Tribune article, my only real thing to point out here is that both of them, the Mr. Prescott and the Tribune editor, both seem to have taken this really seriously, which is even more telling when you consider that it seems like Mr. Prescott was probably in communication with somebody from Sheffield. He lives in Cleveland and he needed to get that article somehow. So if anybody would have had additional context to know that this was a hoax, it probably would have been him, and he seems to have bought it hook, line, and sinker. And in the closing remarks by the Tribune, whoever the editor was seems to have really thought about everything. He mentioned a lot of specific details and plans for it, whilst also seeming to imply that he knows it's all fake. When I read it, it seems like he put a lot of thought into it and maybe even made a few calls over there about it, ultimately at the end to realize that he got duped. So I think this was an intentional hoax. Not really a hot take, but that's really as far as the story goes for me at this present moment, so I wanted to theorize a little bit. I really do want to pick up this story again at some point. I ain't gonna let someone waste dozens of hours of my time and simply get away with it, you know. So to whatever long dead journalist started this all, I'm pretty sure I know where to find you, and I really do want to find you. And if I do, you know what? I'm gonna thank you, because this all was pretty interesting. Is there anything I want to say before I end this all? I don't really know. I'm recording this on 2% right now, so I better finish up what I want to say really quickly. I guess I'm really glad I got to working on this channel again. I had kind of stopped for a while. I really wanted to. It was at the back of my mind a lot, but I personally am quite susceptible to being slothful. I'm recording this Saturday night, March 1st. Hopefully I can finish editing this all sometime early next week. But after that, I really don't know when I'm going to upload again. I'd like to do it within like 2 or 3 weeks of that, maybe. Okay, I'm on 1% now, so I really got to finish up. If you watched this far, thank you so much. Really, I appreciate it. I hope I made your time and attention worth it. And bye. God bless.